say hello for the vast hordes of people who are reviewing the video after the event. We're on our final episode after, as we've just been running through, working out for 3 years, because we started in lockdown. 3 years later, we're coming to the very last episode of this walk through Matthew's Gospel. It's been an absolute privilege from my point of view doing it. I've seen things again. This is the third time I've actually taught all the way through Matthew. This probably the slowest pace that I've gone through it. And actually during the process I've seen new things, including I've finally found something that I'm satisfied with a little point in today. So that's a win from my point of view. Yes, I've called today Risen and Commissioned, because obviously the final chapter we meet the risen Jesus and he commissions his disciples, and of course there's a little interlude about the stories that get told. So going back now, Matthew 28 verses 1-3. So after the Sabbaths, and I've included the plural here because the fact that it's used is one of those things that has been an interesting conundrum. And I finally found the solution to this. So there are those who want Jesus to have to be resurrected. They want, well, it tends to go with a host of things. They see when Jesus says 3 days and 3 nights, just like Jonah. They want Jesus to have been dead fully for 3 days and 3 nights, and they tend to therefore make the Last Supper on the Wednesday, like I do, but then with a very tight overnight kind of trial, and then they have Jesus actually been crucified on a Thursday, and then they see the Friday as being a Sabbath because it's the first day of it's the day of Passover, and then the Sabbath being the Saturday is the next one. And so they say, and this is reflected because Matthew says Sabbaths plural. I take a Wednesday Last Supper, but I see the trial taking over the 2 days effectively. And so I know, and so why is it that Matthew uses the word Sabbaths? And I've seen kind of commentaries with people saying, well, of course he's just making the reference because actually there are the Saturday is a kind of a super high Sabbath, if I can put it that way, because it's a weekly Sabbath. It's a festival Sabbath in the sense of it's the Passover, and then so the Friday is a Sabbath. So but equally, then sorry, I'm losing track of myself. So the Friday night would be Sabbath would start from the Hebrew calendar. The Saturday is a Sabbath because it's a Saturday, but equally it spills into then the extra kind of Sabbath, which is the first day of unleavened bread, which is. So there is a kind of a sense in which it's a Sabbath for multiple reasons. And so people say that's why he says Sabbaths rather than Mark saying just Sabbath. And that's a possibility. But actually, I finally found a proper academic article, because if you look at almost every single English translation, it just says that after the Sabbath. And whereas you could translate, it would seem... and as someone who's been doing this, you can understand how come I came across it. When you look at the words, you could read, and some people have, there are some people who've made an issue of this, you could read the phrase as being late on the Sabbath, and therefore that the women are going on the Saturday evening rather than on the Sunday morning, which then creates a conflict with the very next verse, or as it began to dawn. And then they say, well, it's not really dawn. It's kind of it's in the twilight, so it was beginning to be twilight rather than the dawn, and so it gets all very convoluted and complex. But in actual fact, the word that means late, you see, apparently I found as it's one of those unusual bits of grammar that comes into play. So the word is late, and then it's got plural, but apparently when late and plurals are put together, it becomes after the kind of a big singular. if that makes sense. So, which is why all of the translations just translate it as after the Sabbath, and they don't, on the whole, in commentaries, have any special note about the reason that it's plural Sabbaths here. So it's just simply a slightly unusual grammatical kind of construction, which when you're someone like me who's not experienced and you just kind of get the text out and you read it, you think, well, it could mean late on the Sabbaths, in other words, there were multiple Sabbaths and at the end of them all. So there you go. There's a little thing I learned. It's a bit like the beginning of John's Gospel, where if you just get them, the Jehovah's Witnesses come round and they'll say, oh, but it doesn't say the God, so it could be just Jesus is a God. And you have to understand, although it's a slightly more common grammatical form here, that in Greek grammar, if you had put the, as Jesus was the God, it would be God, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the God. If you put the in there, it confuses which is subject and which is object, you see. And so in actual fact, the dropping of the definitive article in the beginning is actually the consistent way in which grammatically you would say that Jesus was God, as if it's a definitive article without using the word the. So anyway, I'm just saying it's the nuances of Greek grammar that actually mean for someone who just picks up an interlinear or whatever else, they can come up with alternative ways. But actually now after the Sabbath is the correct way. I've included the plural here just to indicate that it is there, and it's not a surprise, but there's nothing suspicious about that, just in case you ever run into people who make a big issue of it. So after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Now Matthew is going to be very tight and very succinct in his description. In that sense, we find a very similar approach in Mark's Gospel. Modern scholarship likes to see Mark as being written first and Matthew kind of taking his lead. I go, the other way around. I see Matthew, as was always understood by the early church, as being written first. But remember that Matthew's Gospel is not so much the product of a single author. Matthew is the scribe who's taken down notes. He's probably also been chair of the committee, if you think of it like that has produced the Apostles' Creed as they've recounted the stories and collected them together and issued them in what becomes then Matthew's Gospel. But Peter has been right at the heart of that. He's been the key witness. And so there's obviously been an early choice made, which is we see reflected in Matthew's Gospel and in Mark's Gospel, which is not to go into details about the resurrection account in the written record, i.e. Matthew and Mark, presumably because they were still in the early phases. The actual witnesses were there and could be interrogated and talked to, and the story would balloon, if you like, if you got all of their different perspectives, how they experienced these things. So Matthew and Mark have reduced the events down to the kind of the factual bits, probably expecting the fact that there is access to apostolic witness at the time of both Matthew and Mark's Gospels being issued, which allows the details to be filled in. By the time we get to Luke, Luke is conscious of the fact that there's a bit of distance. He's writing for the audience that are hearing the Gospel through Paul's preaching, and access to the apostolic witnesses and the other witnesses is not so obvious in that kind of a context. So sorry, this is a very waffly way of saying why it is that Matthew is so quick and so short. So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary come to see the tomb. From Matthew's perspective, Matthew has fled, although of course he's drawing in the perspective of others as well, but Matthew has fled on the night that Jesus is arrested and has probably made his way back to Bethany, which is probably the home, as we've touched on this before, of Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene has been at the cross with the other Mary. At some point they seem to have both arrived back at the same location, perhaps where Matthew is, which is why he only records the two of them as they go to see the tomb. And actually I've just realised it says came to see the tomb. I wanted to actually change that, so just quick memory reminder there, Anne, because you're watching. That should be went to see the tomb. I think I'm going to stick. I meant to change that and didn't do that. So should be the word that's used there. It can be either came or went. It's to do with the process. It makes it easier to reconcile all the Gospels if we see it as went. So we'll remember to do that after this. But look, there was a big earthquake. So it's kind of taking a step back in time now. The two Marys have set out to go and see the tomb, but there's been a big earthquake, and an angel of the Lord descended out of heaven, came and rolled away the stone from the door and sat on it. Now his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. So lightning, of course, creates that sort of almost that glowing after effect in the eyes, and so that's the kind of the effect that Matthew's trying to get here. It's so glowing, and his clothing is as white as snow. Now those keeping guard trembled from fear of him, and they became corpse-like. You'll sometimes see it says things like they became like dead men, but the word men's not there. It's kind of they became corpses. If they became corpses, it kind of implies they're lying around, but obviously we're going to hear they go off, so I've gone for corpse-like. They became as corpses, I think is the way the Greek puts it. But the angel, so the men were like that, but when the women come, even though he's sitting there, the angel addresses them. And you can see he's kind of, the way that Matthew's, this is what I'm trying to drive at, he's squashed it all so much together that you could, if you read it, you could read it as if there's an earthquake, the angel turns up, the men are now lying on the floor, kind of out of it, like corpses, and then the women are there and the angel is talking to them. But we don't get that impression from any of the other Gospels. It's just that Matthew has drawn all of the pieces together. So the angel said to the women, so rather than them collapsing in fear, don't be scared, because I know you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here because he's risen and said, come, and he as risen as he said, full stop. Come see the place where he was lying. Now remember, at the time, the two that are in view here, of course, were presented as being outside the tomb. So Matthew has kind of presented one set of two, and then here are the other two coming, and they're going in to see where Jesus has been. But he goes on, go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead, and look, he goes ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him. See now, I've told you. So the instruction for Galilee is clearly positioned, because that's going to be reflected with the disciples going to Galilee. He goes ahead of you to Galilee, there you'll see him. See now, I've told you. So they hurried away from the tomb for fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And in fact, yeah, okay. Yeah, that again, this is very odd. I thought I'd change that as well. Okay. There's a couple of bits here, Anne, we'll need to amend. The disciples is a slightly inferred word, which is why I was going to change it, but I obviously forgot to do it. It's the trouble when you do a whole chapter, you rush at it. Because I was going to use the word brethren, which would be a better translation. Go and tell his brothers, his brethren. The reason I wanted to avoid the word disciples is that the word that is used can mean disciples, but it is normally used when Jesus uses it for his disciples. It's the wider group of those who are following him seriously. So it's not the 12 who have become apostles, and he's appointed them as apostles. It's not even the 72, because they've also been sent out. So although we're not explicitly told, because it would be confusing us, they have apostle status because they have been specifically sent out by Jesus. When he talks about his brethren in a discipleship sense, it gives you the wider sense of all of those who follow. And so go and tell his disciples is, yes, it's the 12, but it's more than the 12. And as we're going to see, that gives a kind of a context to Galilee as well. So go and tell his brethren or his disciples, he is risen from the dead. Look, he goes ahead of you into Galilee. There you'll see him. So they hurried away from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. So look, as they went to tell his disciples, Jesus met them saying, be happy. They came and took hold of his feet, and they worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go tell my brothers." See, here, I knew I'd done it somewhere. There is my brothers, that you should go into Galilee. In fact, I may have just actually told you a whole load of rubbish. It may be here where it's the word brothers, the brethren word. It may just be on this occasion. So in actual fact, as they go for the disciples, it may be the context that there needs to be a clarification for the wider group, the wider sense of disciples, not just the 12. But so it is all of the brothers, or the brethren, that wider group of disciples who are now being commissioned and told to go into Galilee, and there they're going to see me. So the women have been told by the angel, but they've had it clarified by Jesus. And while they were going, be aware that the guard detail had come into the city, told the chief priests all of the things that had happened. And after they'd met with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a lot of silver to the soldiers. Again, you can see how I was rushing at the translation this morning, because I've got two A's there. They gave a lot of silver to the soldiers, saying, "Say that his disciples came by night and stole him away, we being asleep." So, and we touched on this a little bit last week. And if this is heard by the governor, we will assuage him and keep you carefree. So, as I said last week, in the wording that Pilate uses, there's this kind of ambiguity. He doesn't officially give an order to seal the tomb, but he points out that the temple authorities already have access to some Roman soldier authorized guard. They were there presumably in the rest of Jesus, and to use them to secure the tomb, but without actually saying therefore seal it. If it had been an official seal, almost certainly it would have been impossible to kind of get the punishment let off them. But if actually the guard has been given to is under the control of the temple authorities, and they haven't directly failed in an order given to them by Pilate, other than that they've just been told to serve that community. And if the story comes that even though he sent them off to keep this place secure, it wasn't secure. Therefore, if the temple authorities are saying it's okay, they seem to have they'll have his ear, and there won't be any problem. So you can keep carefree. So the soldiers, they took the money and did as they were told. Again, I'm so sorry. I've made such a horrible mess of my of my text this afternoon. It should say this account is circulated among the Judeans up to today, instead of this saying was account circulated. This account was circulated. I was going to change the word saying to account, and obviously I've inserted it rather than changed it. But I wanted to get two things. One is it's the verse here. This statement is in the present tense, which again makes sense if Matthew's gospel is written while the temple authorities are still standing and they still have currency. And actually this is the story that is being told after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Actually the idea of the account circulating isn't quite as relevant, because people have all had to be pushed out and there's no way of checking, and it's really become a dead issue if you think of it like that. Although it is still circulating, it makes most sense to have it in the present tense here, because actually the temple is still a very live issue, with the people involved still being around. And I've gone with the translation of the Judeans up to today, because I think that in a lot of cases, when we read, particularly in Matthew's Gospel, the Jews, that the form of the way that it's the Jews, it's those of the land of Judea. Now, just as the Galileans is technically those of the land of Galilee, of the region of Galilee. And I think that Matthew doesn't use it, if you like, as a purely ethnic epithet. He uses it as a kind of a cultural epithet for the community of Israelites who live around Jerusalem. and contrasts the Judeans who are around the temple with other Israelites who are Galileans up in the north. And so, that actually helps, because occasionally there are those, in fact, very often within the Jewish community, who see Matthew's Gospels as anti-Semitic because of his use of the word Jews. But actually, if you see it in that kind of slightly more kind of cultural distinction, in the same way that from a distance in the US, people will talk about everyone from the UK as English. But if you live in the UK, you can live with it if people make a mistake and say and refer to the English when they're actually in Wales. But it makes more sense when we talk about the Welsh and the English in that kind of culturally distinct way. So the account is being circulated around Judea, is the way I would see it, as opposed to up in Galilee, where Jesus has told the disciples to go. So he's creating this kind of contrast between where he's telling the disciples to go up into Galilee with those who are still down in the south and are hearing the stories as they're being circulated by the Roman soldiers. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples departed into Galilee. So while that story is circulating, there is a point where the disciples have now left. Matthew just refers to the 11, but actually to understand that even to the 11, even if we think of them, there has been this general thing of "to my brethren," and actually most of the followers of Jesus are situated and based up in Galilee, and within a week or so, and we know of course that the disciples don't leave for at least a week because they're in Jerusalem 8 days later. That probably means they wait before they go to Galilee till after the Feast of Unleavened Bread is completed, and then they go on up. And there are things that happen in Galilee before this event happens in Matthew. But the disciples have gone up and they go to a mountain which Jesus had arranged. So although we don't have the words written in Matthew, it implies here that actually when Jesus spoke to his disciples and said go to Galilee, he also told them a particular mountain to go to. And we can therefore, seeing as that was we inferring that back into something that Matthew had missed out earlier, we could also assume that there was probably a date and time to go as well. That he's actually sent his disciples with a view to all of his brethren back up to Galilee, where his large crowds of followers actually are based. He's given them a location to go to, and presumably as well a date and time. And when they saw him, so they go to that place. And when they get there, they saw him and they worshipped him, although some wavered. The word wavered there is I think a nicer way of translating the word that we sometimes see as the word doubt, because there are two different words that sometimes in the Greek New Testament are used, are translated as doubt. One is about mental wavering, and the other is kind of that active. It's the opposite of faith. It's cynical. I don't believe it, therefore I act, and I act in my unbelief. Whereas this is much more a mental process, which makes sense. So they turn up at the place that Jesus has told them to go, the date, the time, the location. There are, according to, as we fit these things together with the record from Paul, one time there are 500 people. So this is presumably the 500, although Matthew is keeping it focused on the 11 in his reference, and so actually it's in the context of the 11. Although that Matthew is describing that some of them have got some, whoa, what on earth is going on? Which is not to say that the others who aren't mentioned by Matthew but who are presumably there aren't going through the same process. But Matthew is highlighting that actually, as we set out on this gospel journey in the early days of the church, where people are coming on board and they know that God has done something in the person of Jesus, but not all of the theology has been fully worked out. And even while it's being worked out, that isn't necessarily an exclusion from somebody coming into fellowship and experiencing something, because it will only, some of what they're being taught will only make sense as they learn to experience it. And so it's a much more fuzzy process. And so it's quite helpful for Matthew to highlight that even amongst the 11, even as they're worshipping, some of them are having mental, what on earth is going on now? Because that probably is very reflective of the community that Matthew's gospel is being written into. And so having come close, Jesus spoke to them. So it's not that he wasn't there because they've already seen him, but the words that he used there are draw near. Having drawn near, Jesus spoke to them. It says, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And we're going to have a very tight finish to Matthew, which is not dissimilar, as I say, to the tight finish we get in Mark, with all of the confusion as to which does Mark's finish kind of is it verse 9 or is it right the way to the end of 16 and so on. We're not looking at Mark today, but I think they both coming out of the same philosophy, which because Mark's gospel is, if you like, understood as the telling of Peter from his perspective that was recorded by Mark for the church in Rome, and it is actually very early written. It probably comes into its final form, maybe even slightly quicker than Matthew, although I think Matthew started quicker but issued in sections. But in a similar way, both of them are going to come in and be very tight with these endings. And so the sum up of this time, this incredible time where there's a whole host of folks, they're experiencing Jesus. They're coming into a place where they want to worship, but they know that that's in conflict with everything they've been brought up in their Judaism. They've been challenged by the things that Jesus has spoken to them. He said to them, something in that is saying we therefore worship because we do believe, but mentally we're not quite sure what we really think of that. But then in this context, Jesus then speaks to them and says, so everything in all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And then we get what we think of as the Great Commission now. So go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And actually, we're having this little kind of formula here is an answer to the very thing they're wavering on. So Jesus has risen from the dead. What does that mean? And here we have kind of, if you like, in the way Jesus answers it, you're going to baptize people in the name of God. But how are we going to understand the name of God? Well, it's Father, Son and Holy Spirit. You've experienced all three in their separate ways, but I'm drawing them all together into one. And that's the foundation of this authority. There will be a difference. Jesus does not say, for instance, that no one, I'm the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to God but through me. He says no one comes to the Father but through me. That there's something about the Father, Son, Holy Spirit that actually gives us a clarity in our understanding of God, which brings us into a greater sense of power. And it's just as a pastoral level, one of the things I will often kind of challenge folks on. I understand when we often will talk about God, but God is less personal than if I talk about the Father, or if I talk about the Son, or if I talk about the Holy Spirit. And so I can tell in myself there's a little bit of reluctance, because we're always reluctant to share things that expose a kind of something about what we really believe, because there's some vulnerability in that. So I notice that in me, and therefore I want what I find is in my own kind of prayer and conversational life, it's often important for me to be clear, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, when I'm talking, because we're bringing something of a greater sense of vision and revelation of what we understand of God, which is it's out of that clarity, if you like, that the power and the authority really takes place through us, in the sense of the commission that we're called to. So I see that clarity as being absolutely fundamental to the teaching and preaching of what we do. That the Trinity is an important thing that we're making clear, so that we are actually bringing people into that very thing which, if you like, the resurrection of Jesus has so affirmed and so kind of solidified. So baptize them in that name, totally immerse them. That's what baptize means, to continuously immerse them. So a baptism is something that happens in once in the past, but to be baptized is a continuous process. I think I may not have done that as we've walked through Matthew, but For instance, there's a famous recipe for pickles that comes from one of the Greek writers who's quite well known, but I can't think who it is at the moment. And he makes the distinction that when you make a pickle, you give it a baptism in boiling water, which means you drop it in and take it out, and then you baptize it in vinegar. And you put it in the vinegar and it stays there, you see. So there is a slight distinction between the idea of a baptism in, out, and being baptized, which is continuously immersed. So go and make disciples of all nations, continuously immersing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Which doesn't mean you don't drop them in and take them out, give them a baptism, but it's more than that. It's totally getting your head around this Trinitarian idea that gives us something of an insight into the heart of God, which somehow gives us authority in the way we can continue in the commission, in the things that we do. And in that process, teaching them to observe all the things that I commanded or instructed you. And again, I want to kind of draw this in from a discipleship point of view. Jesus' foundation for the beginning of discipleship is if you abide in my words. If you abide in my words, then you're really my disciples, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So discipleship comes right the way down to the things that Jesus teaches. Primarily, before anything else, before any of the things that Paul tells us, which are very practical and pragmatic and about church, salvation and discipleship come back to the words of Jesus. And see, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And even in that final phrase, into the end of the age, there is a sense of the passage of time. Now, it's often been said in the early church, they saw particularly the destruction of Jerusalem as being the end of that age. But actually, we know from the discourse in Matthew 24 that there's kind of a sense of ages, that we're those on whom the ends of the ages have come. So there's the end of one age, but then there's also the start of a new age, and they've overlapped. So there's also an age that is the age to come, which we're in, that haven't got to the end of yet. So Jesus' promise stands right the way through where we are at today. So I've done that at quite a breakneck speed, done the whole chapter. I've encountered some bits where I've made a bit of a hodgepodge as I was rushing through getting things sorted out now for this final session. But before we hand over and say questions, I just want to say, whoa, we finished. We've done the whole of the Gospel of Matthew for the third time that I've gone through like this, but probably the best quality one. Although you might beg to differ, but I'm quite happy to have finished the Gospel of Matthew, not because it's finished, but it feels good to take us right through the story and come back with this kind of triumphant ending that Matthew finishes with. To understand there's something that's happened in Jesus that demands our worship, even if we can't mentally get our head around it and we waver. It shows us something of the nature of God, which is Trinitarian, and authority is tied into that Trinitarian vision of the way in which the whole of God operates, with the way the mind of Christ, the heart of the Father, and the hand of the Spirit. And so we're going to immerse people in that revelation, not just a one-off historic baptism, but to being baptized in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We're going to teach them the things that Jesus spoke to us, with all of their challenges, and all of the ways in which we know we can't live up to the standard, but we're challenged by those things, and to have the assurance that actually the resurrected Jesus, from an eternal perspective, is always with us right through to the end of the age. It's this wonderful kind of squeezed together, rich selection of verses at the end of the gospel. So we'll leave it there, and I'll say, does anyone want to ask any questions? Oh, hang on. Let's go. There we go. Thanks for watching.